In this episode, we are going to make sense of four terms that beginners often hear used interchangeably, even though they do different jobs: procedures, standards, guidelines, and baselines, and how they are designed to operate together as a single, coherent system. If policies are the high-level rules that say what must be true, these four elements are the machinery that makes policy real in daily work. Procedures describe how work is carried out step by step at a high level, meaning they explain the normal path people follow to request access, handle incidents, approve changes, or classify data. Standards describe the minimum technical or operational requirements that must be met, such as authentication expectations, logging expectations, or encryption expectations, without turning into tool-specific instructions. Guidelines provide recommended practices and explanations that help people make good choices when a situation is not fully covered by a standard or procedure. Baselines define a starting configuration or minimum set of controls for a system type, creating consistency and reducing the chance that each team invents its own version of secure. When these elements operate together, they reduce confusion, increase consistency, and create auditable evidence of how security is implemented. When they operate separately or contradict each other, they create friction and workarounds, which makes security weaker and harder to manage. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful way to begin is to understand why organizations need more than policy, because a common beginner misunderstanding is that policy alone should be enough. Policies state expectations, but they do not automatically tell people how to meet them in a repeatable way. Without procedures, people follow different paths, causing inconsistent approvals and missteps. Without standards, teams meet policy goals in inconsistent ways, making security uneven and difficult to audit. Without guidelines, people are left guessing in edge cases, and guessing produces risk. Without baselines, every system begins from a different starting point, which multiplies complexity and increases the chance of obvious weaknesses. A mature security program uses these elements to turn general intent into repeatable practice. The program also uses them to scale, because scaling security requires the same pattern to work across many teams and systems without constant reinvention. Beginners sometimes assume this is bureaucracy, but it is actually a way to reduce wasted effort and confusion. When these elements are designed well, they make the secure path easier, because people know what to do and what good looks like. That ease is one of the strongest drivers of adoption. Standards are often the first element to clarify, because they create consistent expectations that can be measured. A standard is a minimum requirement that must be met, and it is written in a way that can be audited without needing to interpret intent. For example, a standard might require strong authentication for access to sensitive systems, or require that security logs be collected and retained for a defined period, or require that sensitive data be encrypted when stored. Standards should avoid becoming tool manuals because tools change, but the requirements should stay stable. Beginners sometimes write standards that are too vague, like use strong passwords, which does not hold up because it cannot be measured consistently. A stronger standard defines what strong means in a way that supports evidence, such as requiring specific control characteristics or review practices. Standards also help reduce conflict, because teams know the minimum they must meet and can plan accordingly. When standards are clear, security reviews become faster and less subjective, because decisions are grounded in published requirements rather than personal opinion. This consistency is part of what makes standards valuable. Baselines are closely related to standards, but serve a different purpose, and beginners benefit from seeing the difference clearly. A baseline is a starting configuration or minimum set of controls for a particular type of asset, such as a workstation, a server, a database, or an application environment. The baseline is the practical embodiment of standards applied to a specific context, producing a consistent default posture. For example, a baseline might specify that certain security settings are enabled, that certain logging is configured, and that certain access restrictions exist by default. The baseline reduces decision fatigue because teams do not need to decide every security setting from scratch each time they build a system. It also reduces the chance of missing obvious protections because the baseline packages them into the default state. Beginners sometimes think baselines limit flexibility, but baselines can include a defined method for deviations when justified. The key is that deviations are deliberate and documented, not accidental. Baselines also support auditability because they create an expected configuration that can be checked. When baselines are applied consistently, security becomes more predictable and operations become smoother because systems behave in familiar ways. Procedures then provide the human workflow that connects these requirements to daily actions. And this is where many security programs either gain traction or lose it. A procedure describes how a recurring activity should be performed, such as onboarding a new system, requesting access, responding to an incident, or handling a change. Procedures should be clear about roles, decision points, and records, because procedures are as much about coordination as about steps. Beginners sometimes assume a procedure must be extremely detailed, but overly detailed procedures become hard to maintain and hard to follow. A better approach is to describe the sequence and the required checkpoints at a level that guides behavior without becoming tool-specific. For example, an access procedure might describe request, approval, provisioning, verification, and review, with clarity about who approves and how exceptions are handled. An incident procedure might describe detection, triage, containment, communication, recovery, and lessons learned, with clear escalation paths. Procedures make policy real because they turn expectations into repeatable workflows. When procedures are integrated into enterprise processes, they also reduce friction because people can follow a single path rather than improvising. Guidelines are often misunderstood, but they are essential for maturity because real life produces situations that do not fit neatly into a standard or procedure. A guideline provides recommended practices and explanatory context, helping people make good decisions while staying aligned to policy intent. Guidelines are not optional in the sense that they can be ignored without thought. They are optional in the sense that they allow flexibility when circumstances vary. For example, a guideline might recommend how to evaluate the sensitivity of data when classification is unclear, or recommend how to design a process so it is secure and usable. Guidelines can also provide examples of good practices and common mistakes, which is especially valuable for beginners who lack experience. A common beginner error is to treat guidelines as weaker policies and then try to enforce them like standards, which creates confusion. Another error is to treat guidelines as meaningless suggestions and ignore them entirely, which leads to inconsistent decisions. The correct view is that guidelines are decision support, and they help reduce mistakes when people face edge cases. When guidelines are written well, they make the organization smarter by teaching reasoning, not just rules. Teaching reasoning is part of long-term security improvement. These four elements operate together best when they are designed as a hierarchy that supports clarity and maintenance. Policy states the rule, standards define the measurable minimum, baselines package those minimums into default configurations for specific asset types, procedures describe the workflows to apply and maintain them, and guidelines provide support for judgment when situations vary. Beginners sometimes see this as mini documents, but the value is in how the documents reduce uncertainty. The key is consistency. Terminology must match across documents, scope must be aligned, and ownership must be clear. If a standard says logs must be retained, the baseline should reflect that expectation and the procedure should specify how retention is managed and reviewed. If a procedure requires an approval, the policy should state the authority and the guideline can explain how to make good approval decisions. When these pieces fit, the system becomes self-reinforcing because each element supports the others. When they conflict, the system becomes fragile because people do not know which rule to follow. Conflict breeds workarounds and weakens trust. Another important factor is making these elements usable because usability determines adoption. If standards are written in a way that teams cannot interpret, they will either overcompensate or ignore them. If baselines are hard to apply, teams will build systems outside the baseline and create inconsistency. If procedures are slow and confusing, people will bypass them under pressure. If guidelines are too long or too vague, people will not use them when they need help. A mature program designs each element with the listener in mind, using clear language and predictable structure. It also ensures that the secure path is the easiest path, because ease drives compliance. Beginners sometimes think strictness drives compliance, but strictness without usability creates rebellion and hidden behavior. Usability also supports auditability, because when people follow the designed path, records and evidence are created naturally. Natural evidence is better than forced evidence because it is more accurate and less stressful. If you want these elements to hold up, they must work in the real flow of work. Finally, these elements must be maintained as a living system because technology, threats, and business priorities change. Standards may need periodic updates as risks evolve, but updates should be careful to avoid constantly shifting expectations. Baselines may need updates as new system types appear and as old configurations become obsolete. Procedures may need adjustment when the organization changes roles, tooling, or process ownership. Guidelines may need expansion as new edge cases appear and as teams learn what confusion points are common. Maintenance requires governance, meaning clear ownership, review cycles, and a method for approving changes. Without governance, documents drift, and drift produces inconsistency. A mature security program also uses feedback from audits, incidents, and user friction to improve these elements. If people consistently request exceptions, the baseline or standard may be unrealistic or unclear. If incident response is chaotic, the procedure may need clearer role definitions. When maintenance is disciplined, the system improves over time rather than decaying. That discipline is what makes security sustainable. In conclusion, developing procedures, standards, guidelines, and baselines that operate together is about building the practical machinery that turns policy into consistent, repeatable security behavior across an organization. Standards define measurable minimum requirements. Baselines apply those requirements as default configurations for specific asset types. Procedures define the workflows that implement and maintain them, and guidelines provide decision support and reasoning for situations that vary. When these elements are aligned, usable, and governed, they reduce confusion, reduce workarounds, and create auditable evidence through normal operations. When they conflict or are written without regard to real workflows, they create friction and undermine trust, making security weaker rather than stronger. A mature program treats these elements as a connected system that evolves through disciplined maintenance, informed by operational experience and changing risk. When the system operates together, security strategy becomes executable at scale because teams know what to do, what good looks like, and how to prove it.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.